The sexton stood solemnly beneath the archway of Milford's meeting-house porch, vigorously tugging at the bell rope with practiced strength, sending clear, resonant peals ringing through the quiet morning air. As the sound echoed down the village streets, the elderly inhabitants began to emerge from their homes, their figures bent and weary with age as they made their careful way toward the church. Alongside them came the children, their eyes alight with youthful brightness and energy, skipping cheerfully at their parents' sides or else imitating the slow and serious manner of their elders, proud to be clad in the finery of their Sunday garments. Well-dressed bachelors, their appearance carefully arranged, cast subtle, sideways glances at the young women passing by, those pretty maidens whose charm seemed only heightened by the soft radiance of the Sabbath sunlight. To the young men, it felt as if the holiness of the day lent the girls an added grace, making them appear even lovelier than they did during the ordinary business of the week. By the time the majority of the congregation had entered the church and taken their places inside, the sexton began the more deliberate tolling of the bell, a slower, more solemn rhythm, while keeping a steady and watchful eye fixed upon the door of the Reverend Mr. Hooper, awaiting the first sight of the minister's approach. The agreed signal for the bell to fall silent was the moment Mr. Hooper came into view, striding toward the meeting-house, as was his weekly custom, in his habitual quiet and thoughtful manner. However, this time, something was different, so strikingly different, in fact, that it caught the sexton completely off guard. He stopped pulling the bell rope and exclaimed with wide-eyed astonishment, "But what is it that good Parson Hooper has on his face?" Those who were close enough to hear his remark turned instinctively to look, their curiosity piqued. What they saw made them freeze in collective surprise and confusion. Advancing toward the meeting-house was indeed the familiar figure of the Reverend Mr. Hooper, moving with the same meditative and deliberate gait as always, but his face was obscured, hidden behind a dark, mysterious veil. The sight of their own minister so altered, his features shrouded in secrecy, provoked a far stronger reaction than if an entirely unfamiliar preacher had arrived to deliver that morning's sermon. "Are you certain that it's really our parson?" asked Goodman Gray, addressing the sexton with incredulous concern. "I'm certain of it," the sexton answered promptly. "It is most assuredly our own dear Mr. Hooper. He was expected to exchange pulpits today with Parson Shute from Westbury, but just yesterday, Parson Shute sent word of his regrets. He had been called upon to deliver a funeral sermon and was unable to come." The source of such widespread astonishment among the congregation might, at first glance, seem rather minor or trivial. After all, Reverend Mr. Hooper appeared much as he always did, a man of around 30 years of age, possessing a gentle and dignified manner, though still unmarried. His attire, as expected of a clergyman, was neat and proper, exhibiting the kind of tidy precision one might associate with the attentive care of a dutiful wife. His clerical band was perfectly starched, his coat free of lint and the dust of the week, as though lovingly prepared for the Sabbath by invisible hands. Yet despite this familiar appearance, there was one singular and unsettling alteration that completely transformed the impression he gave. Draped around his forehead and falling down to obscure the greater part of his face was a black veil, thin, yet dense enough to provoke unease. As Mr. Hooper moved closer to the church, those who stood nearby could discern more clearly the nature of the fabric. It appeared to be composed of 2 layers of crepe, a mourning material, arranged in such a way that it fully concealed every part of his face above the chin. His eyes, nose, cheeks, and brow were all hidden from view. Only his mouth and a portion of his jaw remained exposed. Though the veil must have allowed him to see, perhaps dimly, the world around him, shrouding everything living and lifeless alike in a shadowed, somber hue, it gave him the appearance of being cloaked in mystery and mourning. The dark drapery shifted slightly as he breathed, giving it an eerie semblance of life. Through this strange and gloomy barrier, Reverend Hooper walked slowly and with calm composure toward the meeting-house, his posture slightly bent, his gaze lowered to the ground in a way that bespoke deep thought or spiritual absorption. Yet for all his internal withdrawal, he did not forget his manners. He offered gentle, familiar nods to the parishioners who lingered on the steps, waiting for the service to begin. However, those kind gestures, usually met with warm greetings and friendly replies, were now met with hushed silence and wide-eyed stares. The veil had unsettled them so completely that they could hardly bring themselves to respond. Their bewilderment and quiet dread rendered them nearly motionless, their eyes fixed on the dark shape of the minister's hidden face. "I can't bring myself to believe that good Mr. Hooper's face is truly behind that piece of crepe," said the sexton in a hushed, troubled tone, his eyes following the clergyman with a mix of confusion and doubt. "I don't like this at all," muttered an elderly woman in a quavering voice as she shuffled unsteadily into the meeting-house. "He's turned himself into something fearful, something unnatural, just by covering his face like that. It's not right." "Our parson has lost his wits," exclaimed Goodman Gray in a burst of alarm, stepping quickly across the threshold after Mr. Hooper, his voice echoing the shared fear that had begun to take root in every heart. Even before Reverend Mr. Hooper crossed the threshold of the meeting house, a vague and unsettling rumor had begun to ripple through the congregation. Whispers of some strange and inexplicable occurrence had spread from ear to ear, setting the entire assembly on edge and casting an atmosphere of anticipation mingled with apprehension throughout the sacred space. People shifted uneasily in their pews, unable to resist the urge to glance repeatedly toward the door. Some twisted awkwardly in their seats, craning their necks in hope, or perhaps fear, of catching a glimpse of the supposed disturbance. Others simply rose to their feet and turned completely around to stare openly. The younger boys, lacking the restraint of their elders, scrambled noisily onto the benches for a better view, their feet clattering down with little regard for decorum. The normally serene and reverent quiet that typically marked the minister's entrance was broken by an almost chaotic murmur. The soft rustling of women's gowns and the impatient shuffling of men's boots created a restless stir throughout the meeting house. The reverent silence that should have welcomed the arrival of their spiritual leader had been replaced with a nervous energy, as though the entire congregation braced itself for the appearance of something uncanny. And yet, in stark contrast to the unease of his flock, Mr. Hooper entered with calm and quiet composure, seemingly untouched by the subtle commotion. His footsteps were so gentle that they scarcely made a sound on the wooden floor. As he walked slowly down the central aisle, he offered his usual mild and respectful inclinations of the head to the rows of pews flanking him, acknowledging his people with serene courtesy. As he passed his oldest parishioner, a venerable gentleman whose hair was as white as snow, seated in a place of honor upon a cushioned armchair in the very center of the aisle, Mr. Hooper paused briefly to bow with special deference. What was most peculiar, however, was how slowly this aged man seemed to comprehend the unusual nature of his pastor's appearance. Perhaps owing to his failing eyesight or the natural reserve of age, he did not immediately register the difference that had so startled the rest of the congregation. It was only when Mr. Hooper reached the pulpit, ascended the steps, and stood there at last, elevated above them all and facing his congregation, that the old man, along with everyone else, fully grasped what made this day unlike any other. There he stood, just as always, but for one stark and chilling detail, his face was completely hidden behind a black veil. This enigmatic symbol, this simple yet deeply disturbing piece of crepe, remained in place throughout the entire service. It never once slipped nor was it lifted. It trembled gently with the cadence of Mr. Hooper's breath as he solemnly intoned the opening psalm. It lay like a dark cloud between him and the sacred scriptures as he read the word of God. And during the prayers, when he lifted his countenance heavenward, seeking communion with the Almighty, the veil still clung heavily to his face. Its oppressive presence seemed to interpose itself not only between him and his parishioners, but perhaps even between him and the divine. One could not help but wonder, was he attempting to conceal himself not only from man, but also from the dread and omniscient being he now humbly addressed? So powerful was the effect of this otherwise modest and unassuming piece of fabric, that it wrought an almost physical response among some members of the congregation. More than one woman, overwhelmed by the eerie symbolism of the veil and unable to suppress her nervous discomfort, was compelled to rise and quietly leave the church. And yet, for all their distress, perhaps the reaction of the congregation, their pale, frightened faces and anxious, questioning eyes, was, to Mr. Hooper, just as unsettling as the black veil was to them. It may well be that the minister, in shielding his own countenance from view, was also shielding himself from the fear and judgment reflected in theirs. Reverend Mr. Hooper had long been regarded as a respectable and morally upright preacher, one whose sermons were always grounded in truth and guided by sincere intentions. Yet, despite the high esteem in which he was held, he was never considered a particularly forceful or dynamic speaker. His preaching was characterized not by fire and brimstone or impassioned exhortations, but by a gentler method of persuasion. Rather than attempting to frighten his congregation into righteousness with the wrathful proclamations often associated with the thunderous word, he sought instead to quietly lead their hearts heavenward through calm and patient guidance, appealing to conscience with tenderness, rather than fear. The sermon he now delivered on this peculiar and disquieting Sabbath morning bore the familiar traits of his usual style, subdued in tone, reflective in nature, and delivered without any dramatic flourish. And yet, on this occasion, the sermon struck the listeners with an extraordinary and inexplicable force. Whether it was due to the haunting nature of the veil that now concealed his face, or the peculiar mood it cast over the assembly, or perhaps the mysterious alignment of the subject matter with the fears hidden deep in every soul, there was something in his words that left a deeper impression than any previous sermon he had ever given. This discourse, more than any before, seemed to carry a heavier emotional weight. It was steeped in a deeper, darker hue of the quiet melancholy that had always marked Mr. Hooper's temperament. The subject he chose for that day was one of intense moral and spiritual gravity, the hidden sins that lie buried within the human heart, those secret transgressions we conceal even from those closest to us, and which we desperately try to keep even from our own awareness. These are the burdens we dare not name aloud, the shameful truths we deny to ourselves in silence, while forgetting that the all-seeing eye of the omniscient God cannot be deceived. There was a strange and subtle power in the way Mr. Hooper spoke of these things. His words, though never raised in volume nor delivered with theatrical intensity, carried an unsettling authority, as if drawn from some hidden well of truth and sorrow. It seemed to each person present, as though the veil itself granted him an otherworldly ability, that the minister was not merely speaking in general terms, but had somehow penetrated the privacy of their souls. Each individual, whether it was the most blameless and innocent maiden or the most hardened and secretive man, felt uncomfortably exposed, as if their darkest thoughts and most carefully concealed deeds had been discovered. Some clutched their chests, their hands pressed over their hearts as if to shield themselves from the piercing insight of the preacher's veiled gaze. There was nothing overtly terrifying in the content of Mr. Hooper's sermon, no fire, no rage, no declarations of eternal damnation, but rather, with every soft and sorrowful tremor of his voice, the listeners trembled. The quiet, mournful cadence of his delivery stirred an ache of conscience within them. A deep and uninvited pathos mingled with a profound sense of awe and dread. So palpable was the transformation in their familiar minister, and so intense was the mystery surrounding his veiled face, that a strange yearning took hold of the congregation. They longed, almost desperately, for some gust of wind to sweep through the meeting-house and lift the black veil from his face. So strong was this desire that some among them nearly convinced themselves that should the veil be removed, it would reveal the face of a stranger, some unfamiliar being wearing Mr. Hooper's clothes, mimicking his gestures and voice, rather than the face they had always known. As the church service came to a solemn close, a sudden and restless energy seemed to seize the congregation. The customary quiet dignity with which the people usually departed was replaced by an almost frantic, disorderly rush toward the doors. Men and women, young and old alike, moved with indecorous haste, eager to leave the shadow of the mysterious black veil behind them. A collective sense of emotional release washed over them the instant Mr. Hooper was out of sight. It was as if a heavy weight had lifted from their spirits, and they breathed more freely, more lightly, in his absence. Outside the meeting-house, groups began to form spontaneously. Some parishioners clustered tightly together in small circles, their heads leaned in and mouths whispering urgently, each trying to make sense of what they had just witnessed. Others walked away in solitude, their brows furrowed in thought, absorbed in silent and troubled contemplation. Still others, in an attempt to shrug off the lingering discomfort, broke into loud conversation, some even laughing inappropriately, their mirth seeming exaggerated, almost forced, as if to defy the weight of the morning's mystery and mask their unease with bravado. In some corners, a few nodded wisely, suggesting with a knowing glance or the shake of a head that they had already deciphered the truth behind the veil. A handful went so far as to declare that there was, in fact, no mystery at all. According to them, the veil served merely a practical purpose. Mr. Hooper's eyesight, they claimed, had grown feeble from long nights spent reading by candlelight, and the black fabric was simply a shade to ease the strain on his vision. After a brief pause, the figure who had been the focus of so much attention and speculation finally emerged. Reverend Hooper stepped quietly out of the meeting-house, following behind the last of his parishioners, as was his humble habit. His veiled face turned gently from group to group as he moved among them, acknowledging each with the respectful manner for which he was known. To the elders of the community, those with silver hair and stooped shoulders, he offered a reverent bow, filled with sincere deference. To the men and women in the prime of life, he extended a courteous and dignified greeting, the kind of address one might expect from a trusted friend and spiritual counselor. The youth he greeted with a soft blend of gentle authority and affectionate warmth, and when he came upon small children, he paused to rest his hands gently upon their heads in silent benediction, bestowing his Sabbath blessing. All of this he had done every Sunday for years, with unwavering consistency and kindness. But now, the veil had changed everything. Instead of being met with warmth and appreciation, his friendly gestures were returned with confused, uneasy stares. The familiar comfort of his presence had been replaced by an unspoken fear. Where once people might have vied for the honor of accompanying their beloved pastor on the walk home, now not a single soul dared draw near. Even old Squire Saunders, a man of importance and hospitality, who had for many years invited Mr. Hooper to dine at his table nearly every Sunday, where the clergyman would customarily offer a prayer of blessing over the meal, forgot, or perhaps chose to forget, his usual invitation. Whether it was a true lapse of memory or a deliberate act of avoidance, no one could say. And so, with quiet resignation, Mr. Hooper returned alone to the parsonage. As he reached the doorway and placed his hand on the latch, he paused and looked back one final time. Though he stood in solitude, he was not alone, for the eyes of the entire village remained fixed upon him. In that moment, a faint and sorrowful smile stirred beneath the edge of the veil, a fragile flicker of emotion that touched the corners of his mouth. The smile glimmered briefly through the shroud of black crape before vanishing altogether as he disappeared into his home. A woman standing among the crowd finally broke the silence. "How strange," she said softly, "that something as simple as a piece of black fabric, a veil no different from what any woman might wear upon her bonnet, should become such a dreadful, haunting thing when placed upon Mr. Hooper's face." Her husband, the village physician, who prided himself on logic and reason, nodded gravely. "There must be something deeply wrong with Mr. Hooper's mind," he remarked, more to himself than to her. "And yet, what troubles me even more than his behavior is the inexplicable effect it has upon others, including a man like myself, who prides himself on being sober and rational. The veil covers only his face, and yet its shadow seems to fall across his entire body. It lends to him a ghostly air, as though he no longer belongs wholly to the realm of the living. Do you not feel it?" "I do indeed," his wife replied quickly, a shiver in her voice. "And I would not, for anything in this world, choose to be alone in his presence. I wonder, does he not fear to be alone with himself?" Her husband, after a thoughtful pause, answered with quiet solemnity, "Men sometimes do." The afternoon service unfolded much like the morning, marked by the same sense of unease and curiosity. When it ended, the church bell began to toll for the funeral of a young woman. Her family and close friends gathered inside the house, while others stood around the entrance, quietly exchanging kind words about the deceased. Their conversation came to an abrupt halt when Mr. Hooper appeared, still wearing the black veil that had caused such stir. At a funeral, however, the veil seemed more fitting, a symbol of mourning and sorrow. Mr. Hooper entered the room where the young woman's body lay and leaned over her coffin to offer a final farewell. As he bent forward, the veil fell straight from his forehead, hanging directly over the lifeless face. Had her eyes not been closed in death, she might have seen the minister's own face clearly for the first time that day. Was it fear of even the dead seeing him unveiled that caused Mr. Hooper to suddenly pull the cloth back over his features? One observer, an old, superstitious woman, later claimed that in the exact moment the veil slipped and revealed his face, the corpse gave a faint shudder, rustling the shroud and muslin cap, though her expression remained fixed in the stillness of death. From the coffin, Mr. Hooper moved to the room where the mourners were gathered, and then stood at the top of the stairs to deliver the funeral prayer. It was a deeply moving prayer, sorrowful yet filled with the promise of heaven. His words were so tender that some listeners imagined they heard the faint music of a heavenly harp echoing within his voice. The congregation trembled, though they didn't fully grasp the meaning, when Mr. Hooper prayed that they, like the departed young woman, would be ready for the moment when death would strip the veil from every soul. The pallbearers carried the body slowly out of the house, and the mourners followed behind, casting a somber spell over the street. At the very end of the procession walked Mr. Hooper, his black veil still in place. "Why do you keep looking back?" one person whispered to her companion. "I thought," she said softly, "that I saw the minister walking hand in hand with the spirit of the dead maiden." "And strangely," the other replied, "I had the same thought at that exact moment." That night, Milford Village was to witness a joyful event, the wedding of its most attractive young couple. Although Mr. Hooper was generally considered a solemn man, he was known to carry a quiet, gentle cheerfulness on such happy occasions. His calm and heartfelt demeanor often brought warm smiles from others, even when louder celebrations might have felt out of place. This gentle joy was one of the qualities that made him especially beloved by his community. The guests at the wedding waited eagerly for his arrival, hoping that the strange tension surrounding him throughout the day would finally lift, giving way to a lighter mood. But their hopes were quickly dashed. When Mr. Hooper entered, the first thing everyone noticed was that the black veil still covered his face, the same veil that had cast a shadow over the morning service and the funeral. Now, at the wedding, its presence felt even more ominous. The effect was immediate and chilling. It seemed as though a dark cloud had emerged from beneath the veil and dimmed even the warm glow of the candlelight. As the bride and groom stood before the minister, the bride's hand trembled in her groom's grasp, and her face turned so pale that some whispered the buried maiden from earlier that day had risen from her grave to take part in the ceremony. If any wedding ever rivaled in gloom the one where the bells tolled a funeral knell instead of a wedding chime, this was it. After completing the vows, Mr. Hooper lifted a glass of wine and offered a gentle, light-hearted toast to the couple. His words, full of soft humor, should have brought comfort and smiles, like a warm glow from a hearth on a cold night. But in that moment, he happened to catch sight of himself in a nearby mirror. The image of his veiled figure struck him with the same horror that it inspired in others. He shuddered violently, his lips turned pale, and the wine slipped from his hand, spilling onto the carpet. Without another word, he fled into the night. Outside, it was as if the entire world wore a black veil. The following day, the whole village of Milford could talk of nothing else but Parson Hooper and his mysterious black veil. The topic spread like wildfire, neighbors chatted about it in the streets, and women gossiped about it from their windows. The local tavern keeper made it the first piece of news he shared with his patrons. Even the children, on their way to school, talked about the strange veil. One mischievous boy, trying to imitate the minister, tied a black handkerchief over his face. But he ended up scaring his friends so badly, and himself even more, that the joke nearly cost him his senses. It was truly remarkable that, in a parish full of curious and outspoken individuals, not a single person dared to ask Mr. Hooper directly why he had chosen to wear the black veil. In the past, whenever there was even the slightest reason for concern or advice, Mr. Hooper had never lacked for people willing to offer their opinions, and he had always shown a willingness to listen. In fact, his greatest fault may have been a deep and painful self-doubt. Even the gentlest criticism could cause him to see a harmless action as a serious mistake. Despite this well-known sensitivity, no one among the congregation had the courage to speak to him about the veil in a friendly or concerned manner. There was a shared but unspoken fear surrounding the veil, a quiet dread that made each person hope someone else would take the initiative. Eventually, the matter became too pressing to ignore, and it was decided that a small group from the church should be sent to speak with Mr. Hooper before the situation turned into a full scandal. However, the delegation failed miserably in their task. Mr. Hooper greeted them kindly and welcomed them in with his usual politeness. But once they were seated, he fell silent, leaving it entirely up to them to begin discussing the matter. The reason for the visit was obvious. The black veil wrapped around Mr. Hooper's forehead, hiding every part of his face above the mouth, where a faint, sorrowful smile sometimes flickered. Yet, to them, the veil seemed to cover more than his face. It seemed to hide his heart, a symbol of some dark secret he carried within. They felt that if he would only remove it, they could speak freely, but until then, the weight of the mystery was too great. And so they sat in uncomfortable silence, hesitant and uneasy, avoiding his gaze, which, though hidden, still seemed to pierce through them. Eventually, the delegation returned to the church deeply embarrassed, declaring that the issue was too serious for them to handle alone. If it was to be addressed at all, it would require not just their own council, but perhaps even a broader gathering of churches, or a full synod. But there was one person in the village who was not shaken by the fear and mystery that the black veil had cast over everyone else. When the church deputies returned without any answers, and without even daring to ask for one, she resolved, with calm determination, to confront the growing shadow that seemed to surround Mr. Hooper more with each passing day. As his fiancée, she believed it was her right to know what the veil truly meant and what it concealed. So, during Mr. Hooper's next visit, she approached the subject directly and simply, in a way that made the conversation easier for both of them. After he had taken his seat, she fixed her gaze on the veil. But unlike others, she saw nothing terrifying in it, just 2 layers of black crepe, falling from his forehead to his mouth, gently moving as he breathed. "No," she said aloud with a smile, "there's nothing frightening about this veil, except that it hides the face I've always loved to look at. Come now, my dear, let the sunshine break through the cloud. First, take off the veil. Then tell me why you ever put it on." Mr. Hooper returned a faint, sad smile. "There will come a time," he said softly, "when we will all remove our veils. Until then, dearest, do not be upset with me for wearing this one." "Even your words are mysterious," she replied gently. "At least lift the veil from them and help me understand." "Elizabeth," said Mr. Hooper, "I will tell you as much as my promise allows. This veil is a symbol, a representation, and I am bound to wear it always, in brightness and in darkness, alone or among crowds, with strangers and with those dearest to me. No one, living or dead, will ever see me remove it. This dark curtain must forever separate me from the rest of the world. Even you, Elizabeth, cannot pass behind it." "What heavy sorrow has come upon you," Elizabeth asked earnestly, "that you would choose to darken your eyes forever like this?" "If it is a sign of mourning," Mr. Hooper answered, "then, like many others, I have sorrows deep enough to be symbolized by a black veil. But what if the world refuses to see it as a symbol of innocent grief?" Elizabeth insisted. "You are beloved and respected, but still, people may begin to whisper that you wear the veil out of guilt for some hidden sin. For the sake of your sacred position, put an end to this growing scandal." Her face flushed with emotion as she hinted at the rumors already circulating through the village. Yet Mr. Hooper remained calm and gentle. He even gave her that same faint, sorrowful smile that always seemed like a dim light trying to shine through the veil's darkness. "If I wear this veil because of sorrow, that alone is reason enough," he said simply. "And if I wear it for secret sin, then what man on earth could say he has no need to do the same?" With this quiet but unyielding resolve, he resisted all her pleas. Elizabeth eventually fell silent, deep in thought, perhaps considering what else she might try to bring him back from this strange obsession. Though she was the stronger of the two, tears streamed down her face. But then something changed. As she stared at the veil, a sudden fear came over her, as if a shadow had passed over the room, and she trembled. "So, you feel it now?" Mr. Hooper asked sadly. She gave no answer, only covered her eyes with her hand and turned to leave. He quickly reached out and took her arm. "Have patience with me, Elizabeth," he cried with desperation. "Don't abandon me. Don't leave me behind this veil alone. Marry me, and I promise that one day, in the life beyond this one, there will be no veil, no barrier between our souls. This veil is only for this world. It does not belong to eternity. You don't know how lonely I am, how afraid I am behind this black veil. Don't leave me in this terrible darkness forever. Lift the veil just once and look me in the eyes," she said quietly. "I cannot," he replied. "I will not." "Then this is goodbye," said Elizabeth. She gently pulled her arm away from his grasp and slowly walked out, pausing at the doorway to cast one long, trembling look back, almost as if she could pierce the mystery behind the veil. Even in his sorrow, Mr. Hooper found a faint, sad comfort in the thought that only a simple piece of fabric had come between him and happiness, though it also represented the much deeper and darker truths that can come between even the closest of lovers. From that day on, no one tried to make Mr. Hooper remove the black veil, nor did anyone directly question him about its meaning. Those who thought themselves above common superstition dismissed it as a harmless eccentricity, an odd habit, perhaps bordering on madness, but not unusual in otherwise rational people. To the general public, however, Mr. Hooper became a figure of fear. He couldn't walk through town in peace, knowing that the timid would avoid him entirely, while the bold made a show of confronting him. This growing discomfort eventually forced him to abandon his routine evening walks to the cemetery. Whenever he stood pensively at the gate, he could feel the eyes of curious onlookers hiding behind tombstones, peeking at his veil. A rumor even spread that the dead themselves stared at him until he could no longer bear their gaze. What pained him most deeply, though, was the way children ran from him in fear, abandoning their joyful games the moment they saw him in the distance. Their innocent fear affected him more than anything else, as it showed how deeply people associated his veil with something unnatural and frightening. In fact, Mr. Hooper disliked the veil so much himself that he avoided mirrors and would not drink from still water, afraid to catch a glimpse of his own reflection. This behavior fueled speculation that he was hiding some terrible sin, something too awful to reveal outright, but which showed itself through the symbolic veil. In time, the veil seemed to cast a shadow over everything. Whether it represented guilt or sorrow, it separated Mr. Hooper from the rest of the world. Love and sympathy could not reach him. Some even said he was followed by ghosts and demons. He lived always under its shadow, haunted both by inner anguish and the fear of others. It was even believed that the wind itself would not lift his veil. And yet, through it all, Mr. Hooper continued to wear his gentle, sorrowful smile as he passed by the pale and uneasy faces of those around him. Despite all the negative effects of the black veil, it had one positive outcome: it made Mr. Hooper a remarkably effective clergyman. The mysterious symbol gave him a strange spiritual authority. No other explanation seemed possible. He became a powerful figure for those suffering from guilt and sin. His converts spoke of him with a unique kind of fear, often saying that, before they found salvation, it felt as though they had stood with him behind the veil. The sorrow it symbolized allowed him to deeply empathize with the darkest emotions. Dying sinners called for him by name and refused to pass away until he arrived. Yet even as he leaned in to comfort them, they shuddered at the sight of his hidden face so close to theirs. The veil inspired fear, even in the presence of death. Curious strangers traveled from far away to attend his church, not to hear him preach, but simply to catch a glimpse of the man whose face was never seen. Still, many left feeling shaken by more than they expected. On one occasion, during the administration of Governor Belcher, Mr. Hooper was chosen to deliver the election sermon. Wearing his veil, he preached before the governor, council, and lawmakers, leaving such a powerful impression that the laws passed that year reflected a deep sense of piety and somber reflection, reminiscent of the earliest Puritan times. And so Mr. Hooper lived out his long life, outwardly blameless in conduct, but shadowed by unsettling suspicion. He was kind and affectionate, yet remained unloved and quietly feared. He became a man apart, avoided during moments of joy and health, but always called upon in times of suffering and death. As the years passed and the veil grew older with him, he became known throughout New England's churches as Father Hooper. Most of the people who had once welcomed him to the parish were now buried. His congregation in the graveyard had grown larger than the one inside the church. Having worked faithfully into old age, it was finally time for Father Hooper to rest. In the dim light of his deathbed chamber, several figures gathered. He had no family, but present were a solemn physician, trying only to ease the final pain, the deacons and other devoted members of the church, and the Reverend Mr. Clark from Westbury, a passionate young minister who had rushed over to be by his side. Also there was the nurse, not a hired helper, but someone who had quietly and lovingly stayed with him through the years. It was Elizabeth. And there, on the pillow, lay the old minister's white-haired head, the black veil still covering his face. With every faint breath, it moved slightly. That piece of black fabric had followed him through life, separating him from human affection, from love, and from joy, locking him in the loneliest of prisons, his own heart. And now it still rested on his face, as if to darken even the final moments of his life and shield him from the brightness of eternity. In his last days, his mind wandered, shifting between memories of the past and unclear visions of the afterlife. He had feverish episodes that drained his strength, and even in his most delirious moments, he clung to the veil with anxious determination, terrified it might slip. Even if he had forgotten it in confusion, Elizabeth, still faithful, would have quietly covered his face again, unwilling to look upon it now that age had replaced the youthful features she had once loved. Eventually, he lay still, his mind and body exhausted. His pulse was almost gone, and his breath came in faint whispers, except when, now and then, a deep gasp hinted that his soul was ready to depart. The minister from Westbury stepped closer to Father Hooper's bedside. "Venerable Father Hooper," he said, "your release from this world is near. Are you ready for the lifting of the veil that separates time from eternity?" At first, Father Hooper only responded with a faint movement of his head. Then, perhaps worried that he hadn't been clear, he made the effort to speak. "Yes," he said weakly, "my soul has waited patiently for the veil to be lifted." Reverend Mr. Clark continued, "But is it right that a man so devoted to prayer, so pure in life and thought, at least by human standards, should leave behind a shadow that could stain his memory? I beg you, do not let it end this way. Let us see your face, your peaceful expression, before you pass on. Before you cross into eternity, allow me to remove this veil." As he said this, Reverend Clark leaned forward, intending to uncover the face that had been hidden for so long. But with a sudden burst of strength that shocked everyone in the room, Father Hooper pulled his hands from beneath the blanket and firmly pressed them against the veil, determined to resist any attempt to remove it. "Never!" he cried. "On earth, never!" "Dark old man," exclaimed the startled minister. "What dreadful secret are you carrying with you to judgment?" Father Hooper gasped, his breath rattling in his throat, but he fought to stay alive just long enough to speak. With great effort, he sat up in bed, trembling as death drew near. The black veil still hung over his face, now seeming even more dreadful as it gathered the weight of a lifetime's mystery. Yet beneath it, that familiar faint and sorrowful smile flickered once more. "Why do you fear me alone?" he cried, turning his veiled face toward the pale onlookers. "Fear each other as well. Have people shunned me, shown me no kindness, and fled in terror, not because of this veil itself, but because of what it represents? It is the hidden sins, the secrets we all carry, that give this veil its power. When friends can bare their hearts to one another, when lovers reveal their true selves, when no man hides his sins even from God, then, and only then, call me a monster for wearing this symbol. But until that day comes, I look around me, and I see a black veil on every face." As his listeners recoiled in shared fear, Father Hooper sank back onto his pillow, the veil still covering his face. He died with that faint, sad smile lingering on his lips. They buried him as he had lived, veiled. Even now, many years later, as grass has grown and died over his grave and moss has spread across his tombstone, the thought remains deeply haunting, that his face turned to dust beneath the black veil.